I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the bloody battle for the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol, and Dom Nicholls speaks to Britain's Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, while on a trip to Finland.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 5th of May, day 71. And today I'm joined by Defence and Security Editor Dom Nicholls and Deputy Foreign Editor Theo Merz. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from the front line.
Hi David, hi everybody. So mainly the artillery duels are carrying on. I'll come back to that in just a moment, but the other big news is that there is a renewed offensive, very, very violent in the Azovstal plant down in Mariupol, the last holdout of the Ukrainian forces in the coastal city down there. The fighting is very heavy down there. Never mind, Russia said a week ago that they'd completed their operation, or however they worded it. But there's very, very heavy fighting going on there. Still hundreds of civilians, or expected hundreds of civilians, certainly high dozens of civilians trapped in the plant, and thousands more in the city itself. So that is not to be welcomed at all, that there's very heavy fighting in Azovstal. As I said, elsewhere in the Donbass, there's the artillery duels, as we should sort of customize it. There's Russia has been targeting supply lines. There's a bridge and the railway facility in Dnipro, and other power facilities have been hit. Equally, Ukrainian forces have been shelling areas in the Donbass, and there are Russian ammunition and oil depots or storage facilities that have been hit there. So again, that sort of tit for tat, or as I say, the continued artillery duels going on there, and still pressure in the north. Not huge advances in the last 24 hours, but still great pressure to the north and the northeast of Kharkiv, where Ukrainian forces are having some local tactical success, pushing the Russians back. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Dom. Theo, do you have much to add to that?
Yes, just on the Azovstal plant in Mariupol, we were told earlier today that there would be a humanitarian corridor to get or at least some of the civilians remaining in that plant out and to safety in Ukraine. The Kremlin has said in the last hour that those humanitarian corridors are functioning. But from what we're hearing on the ground and from what we're getting from the Ukrainian side, from authorities in Kiev, there's really bloody battles being waged right now in the plant. We found out yesterday that Russian forces had managed to break through defences and into the bunkers around the plant, or into the grounds of the plant itself. So it's very hard to get a clear picture of what is going on there. There haven't been independent journalists in Mariupol for quite a long time because of the security situation, but it certainly doesn't seem like the situation is one in which evacuations can be happening at the moment in the way that we have seen earlier in the week.
Thanks, Theo. Also, can we talk about, there was an interview done by Alexander Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, that he gave to the Associated Press. Theo, I know you wanted to talk about this. I thought it was a rather revealing interview. What did he say?
Yeah, it was interesting. So what he said was that he thought the war was dragging on, and that he would do everything that he could to stop it. And it's always rather hard, literally, to work out what Lukashenko is saying, because he often contradicts himself in speeches. And when you're following his speeches as a journalist, you sometimes think, this is what he means, or this is what we have to report, and then he'll row back on it, or he'll qualify it in some way. But from what he said in this interview with the Associated Press, it does seem to be slightly distancing himself from Putin. He's not saying this is a wonderful thing that he is doing in Ukraine, and he has my backing for as long as it takes, even though Putin is Lukashenko's only ally on the global stage. He totally isolated himself from Europe by cracking down hard on protests in his own country a couple of years ago. So he really relies on Putin economically, politically, diplomatically. So it's interesting that he is slightly contradicting the Kremlin here. And what he was calling for in the same interview is a return to negotiations. He said in this rather Trump-like way that I am the only person who will be able to mediate or facilitate these negotiations. They have to happen in Belarus, as the talks that began and failed at the start of the conflict did happen. They happened just over the Ukrainian Belarusian border. And I don't think this has a huge practical significance for the conflict. Belarusian forces were expected. We were sort of thinking that they might get involved at the start of the invasion, but that hasn't happened on a large scale. So it's not that he is withdrawing a significant military support for Putin, but perhaps it's showing that Putin is more isolated than even he expected. And when Lukashenko does this thing of sort of saying one thing and you're not quite sure whether he means it or not, it's often it sounds very silly, but there's a clever logic there that he's trying to play Putin and the West off against each other in a way and show that I'm not entirely with the Kremlin and I'm not with Europe, so you have to work a little bit more for my support, and you have to give me what I want as well. So it's just an interesting development for the day, this interview with Associated Press.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in there, I think that's backed up by a couple of messages from the British MOD in the last 24 hours. Firstly, as you said, I've been in Finland. I just got back from Finland with on a visit with the Defence Secretary, and we were talking about Belarus and this idea, certainly in the first few weeks of the war, that they might either participate or just lend material support, or as it seems to be, they've just proved to be an area for Russia to reconstitute the forces that were pushed out of the north of the country. But the Defence Secretary was playing down any likelihood of significant Belarusian involvement. He said they seem to have a bit of a problem at the moment with, and this is a quote, with their exploding railway lines, suggesting the images that we've seen recently, a number of images of supposed sabotage. We're not entirely sure what's happened, but somebody's been having to go at a lot of the railway lines in Belarus to which would stymie, or certainly slow down any Russian movement. So Ben Wallace was, if not playing down the threat, he certainly wasn't suggesting that Belarus are about to take a much greater active interest. And the second thing to note is that the British Defence Intelligence today, they've put out a note about a number of military exercises that Belarus is about to, or that it is conducting at the moment, and they say this is totally in line with seasonal norms. This is the sort of end of their winter exercise season. We shouldn't immediately suggest that increased movement of military forces in Belarus shows a different intent or some kind of change of direction. The Defence Intelligence note does warn that Russia might try to, and this is a quote, inflate the threat posed by the exercises. Exercises have historically been used as a false front, and then they suddenly launch over the border, and the exercise turns into the invasion. So they're not suggesting that. They're quite the reverse. Actually, they're suggesting that these are normal, and the note suggests that there has been no deviation, which would suggest an increased threat has been seen or currently anticipated. So there's some movement, heavy metal movement north of the border, but seasonal norms at the moment, and the British Defence Secretary playing down any significant increase in Belarusian involvement in Russia's war.
Can we just go back for a moment to Mariupol and Azovstal and the Azovstal steel plant? We've mentioned it a few times, but just because this particular siege has been going on for so long, if we do see a conclusion of that battle in the next few days or even today, what's the impact of that on the war?
Well, let's look at both sides here. First of all, for Russia, they will claim a victory, but how that will sit with the claim 2 weeks ago that their mission was over is debatable. Secondly, the forces that they'll free up, we've been led to believe there's about 9 Russian battalion tactical groups involved in this fight in Mariupol. How many of those are specifically aimed against the Azovstal plant, we don't know. Whether those battalion tactical groups are still at the starting strength of about 600 or 700 personnel, we're not sure. And there have been reports that about 3 or 4 battalion tactical groups have moved north as Mariupol, the fight has just focused on the Azovstal plant. 3 or 4 battalion tactical groups have been diverted north to go and fight in the Donbass. And as we said before, those Russian forces are going to take weeks. I mean, it's not days to reconstitute them. They've had an exceedingly hard fight in the urban setting of Mariupol. They can't just sort of flick north, head up, and off you go into the Donbass. It will take some time for them to reconstitute. So if Russia were to prevail in Mariupol, it would have no immediate operational impact. On the Ukrainian side, it would be a tragedy, a civilian-led tragedy, because they are in vastly great numbers than the fighters. I mean, being a bit callous, if you like, being a bit cold-hearted here. They've already got their victory. So Ukraine have got the legend of the Mariupol resistance. That can't be taken away from them. No matter what happens to the fighters that are left, that dogged resistance, a bit like Snake Island at the start and some of the other images and legends that we've seen, this is already baked in. It's there for keeps. So, of course, we don't want unnecessary loss of life, but this will be held up as a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. It will be marked nationally and for many years to come, I would imagine. So if the Azovstal plant falls to Russia today or whenever, I don't think that will in any way dilute the great symbolic effort that it already is. So yes, it as we've said for some time now, Mariupol is not tactically significant for either side. It is strategic. It has been strategically significant for some weeks now, and Ukraine have won that strategic battle. Again, as I say, it's a bit cold-hearted to say, regardless of the loss of life, and I'm not disregarding the loss of life, but I'm saying that the fact of that resistance is a strategic success in its own right, in a way that it simply cannot be. No matter what Putin says, that may be fine. Okay, this might be the victory he wants to announce on Monday, the 9th, but it's not. I mean, this strategic resistance is Ukraine's victory.
Thanks, Dom. Anything to add on that, Theo, or shall I continue with some other questions?
Yeah, I think Dom is absolutely right there, that it's about saving the lives for Ukraine, it's about saving the lives of the civilians who are still in the steel plant, but it's also this symbolic victory. And only today, authorities in Kiev were saying this is our number one priority in the conflict, which in some ways looks rather strange when they say that, because it, as Dom says, it doesn't have a strategic significance at all. But as well as saving the lives of the people who are there, it has this huge symbolism, and so I think that is the important thing, and that is really what they mean when they say it's our number one priority.
Thanks for that. Let's move on. There's an interesting thing today, I thought. Ukraine's first Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food, this is Taras Vysotsky, has claimed that Russian forces have taken a total of 400,000 tons of grain from the occupied regions in Ukraine. Theo and Dom, why have they done this?
Yeah, well, this was earlier this week, and what this minister was saying is that they are trying to use hunger as a weapon of war by depriving these areas of the grain that they need, and this has really horrific historical echoes in Ukraine because of the famines that Stalin imposed on the country, again through wheat shortages and collectivization, to get the country to submit to Soviet rule and to Moscow. And to Moscow rule, and there was a huge loss of life there. Incredibly grim stories of cannibalism from the Ukrainian countryside because the famine was so severe, and this is marked as a national tragedy, sort of on the same level as the Holocaust in Ukraine. So it has these really terrible historical echoes, and it's hard in a way to see if this is the case, if Russia has taken so much grain from these regions, why else it would be doing that. And I think earlier this week a Russian MP said, and this was briefly reported online through pro-Kremlin media before it was deleted, that he said that we must use these sort of excess grain in Ukraine to make up shortfall in Russian domestic supply. So there was somebody coming out, albeit briefly, and saying that this is where the grain is going to be going, and it's hard to explain in another way if that has indeed been happening.
Thanks, Theo. Yes, I just thought it was interesting, and as you said, horrifying that on the one hand you've got forces in the south using the old Soviet flags, and then these tactics as well, which, as you said, hark back to the Holodomor and hark back to the 1930s. Dom, one question to you before we talk. Yes, Dom, would you like to come in?
I was just going to make the point. I was going to, in the absence of Francis's amazing historical brain, which I can't compete with when he's in the same room as me. So now he's not here, I can have a go. I would just remind people of the hunger winter, 1944-45. This was after Operation Market Garden in the Second World War, when British and Allied forces, thousands of Americans, tried to take the bridges and get into Germany and push for the victory prior, which would undoubtedly, if the bridges had fallen, probably have been over by Christmas 44. The third bridge, Arnhem Bridge, didn't fall, and the Dutch civilians around there were subjected to huge reprisals by the German forces, such that winter 44-45 became known as the Hunger Winter, with great starvation. But what it didn't do was turn the population either against their own forces or against the Allies for trying. And there's very, very close ties to this day. I enjoy going back to Arnhem each September for the commemorations there. Partly because I serve with airborne forces, so there's a link anyway. But there's great affinity between the town of Arnhem and the immediate area around there for the efforts that were done on their behalf, and this tragic time when thousands of civilians died because of starvation through the hunger winter is seen at the time and now as another totem of resolve, and did not split the Allied effort, civilian and military, Allied effort against Germany. So hunger being used as a weapon of war, it's horrific, and I would have to check the lawyer, but I would imagine it's against all kinds of Geneva Conventions and international law. But it doesn't really work. It seems to stiffen the resolve of the defenders. So an interesting historical narrative there, just with what's going on at the moment.
Thanks, Dom. Yes, well, this actually leads right into my question to you before we talk about Finland. A note from Britain's Defence Ministry yesterday said that Russia continues to hit non-military targets in Ukraine, such as residential properties, transport hubs, to weaken the country's resolve. I think we've known for weeks that hasn't worked. So I'd like to ask, why do you think they're still doing it?
Because they haven't got any precision-guided munitions left, or they haven't got enough. And the Air Force is reluctant to operate by day and very reluctant to operate ahead of its own forces. So they are having to operate from airfields in Russia. They are firing long-range ammunition, Air Force are. The ground forces are firing long-range artillery, which is just not as accurate as if the longer the range, the less accurate it's going to be. They've got very few precision-guided munitions left. They, if they are trying to think about it strategically, they seem to be trying to hold these things to interdict some of the more high-value targets. Maybe trying to hold them back for an eventual push again on Kyiv. We're not quite sure, but the evidence on the ground is that there are very, very few strikes now by precision-guided munitions, and therefore there's a lot of civilian casualties, a lot of collateral damage being spread around the whole of Ukraine.
Thanks, Dom. I thought that's an incredibly useful answer. So, Dom Nicholls, you've been in Finland. Can you tell us a little bit about your trip? You travelled with the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. Why was he going to Finland?
Yeah, so Ben Wallace headed out to Finland to visit a British Army exercise. The Queen's Royal Hussars were on exercise with Challenger 2 tanks, operating with Finnish counterparts, Americans as well. And he was also going to visit his opposite number, Antti Kaikkonen, the new Finnish defence minister. And so it was a whistle-stop tour into Finland. And then on the way back today, he stopped off in Norway, and he's back in UK at some point later today. So it was to, obviously, against the backdrop of this expected bid for membership of NATO by Finland and Sweden. Both countries historically cool to NATO, prided their independence, and Finland had historical ties with the Cold War for why they were less keen to join NATO. The pejorative term, and it is pejorative, the Finlandization, which suggests that a country that is not in total control of its own foreign policy. This is the suggestion that after Finland was only not subsumed into the Warsaw Pact because it agreed not to join NATO and to basically cede some of its foreign policy ambitions to Soviet Russia's will. That is not the case anymore, of course. And given the events in Ukraine since February the 24th, it's now looking extremely likely that they will apply for membership of NATO. Certainly the public opinion has shifted very much in that favour. It was, as I say, it was under 50% until quite recently. I think the latest poll in January had it just under 50% of the public were supportive of a NATO membership bid. It's now well over. It's into the high 60s now. I'm looking at very likely. It's looking likely that the next big NATO summit in June in Madrid will see some movement on this. And so it was not. Ben Wallace didn't go there to try and twist their arm or try and convince them. He was very clear that it's entirely their decision. But Finland and Sweden, he was saying that actually a lot of what the war in Ukraine is about is the freedom to choose. Now, choose your destiny, choose your own foreign policy, choose your strategic direction as a country, as a sovereign state. That is more important than what the choice is. He said NATO would welcome both countries in, very close defence ties already with both of them. And he was clambering all over a CV-90 infantry fighting vehicle that Finland were fielding. And it was very popular. I was asking the British soldiers there what they thought of it. They all absolutely loved it. And totally independently of each other said, what's the best thing? They all went, heated seats, and you've got to know what's important. But yeah, the CV-90 Swedish-made vehicle. Ben Wallace was in Sweden recently. I asked him if that was a recce to, after he ditches Ajax, to spend some money buying CV-90, and he absolutely took that idea out from underneath me. But watch this space. So a day visiting the troops and a meeting his opposite number, and it was very interesting actually what he had to say just about the war more broadly. He was saying that there's huge issues at the moment with Russian leadership. He says they're blaming each other for the disaster, as he describes it, and he says it's a quagmire at the moment, and it could easily turn into a rout. There's poor morale, there's high casualties, there's a lack of leadership. They're just not performing, and he was saying that there's a blame game going on in Moscow at the moment, and I think we've seen that. And I asked him about General Gerasimov. So Valery Gerasimov, the head of the Russian armed forces, visited Ukraine last week. Forget my days. Yeah, it was last week, wasn't it? There were suggestions that he was wounded in an attack. We now don't think that did happen. And I asked Ben Wallace, and he said that they had no information to back that up. So we don't think that Gerasimov was injured, but he was certainly in Ukraine for a few days. And I asked if he was sent down there to be Putin's fall guy, for someone to pin the blame on. And he said, well, they're all in fall guy territory. And he said, this is a quote, "Be careful if you're put in sole command of something in the Russian system, because it may not be for long." But he also said that if Gerasimov goes, what does that say about Putin's judgment? And so there's this interesting sort of dichotomy now about does Putin try and get rid of some of these senior generals, try and blame the military for the mess, but at the same time, then he's responsible for putting those people in the positions in the first place. So quite an interesting sort of view on the leadership. He also said that the number of generals that we've seen that have been killed, I think we're up to a dozen now, something like that. He said they've been going forward, and they've been bullying and screaming and shouting. That's their model of leadership. He said it wasn't a model that he particularly thought was very effective. I did ask him if it was the model that they used in the Home Office, and he just sort of laughed a little bit and refused to commit one way or the other. And I'll just pause there for a few more thoughts in a moment, but just in case you had any comebacks on those two things.
Yeah, I'm just looking at your notes. I thought it was interesting, the note about him talking about how old the munitions are that the Russians are using, 40-year-old munitions, and how he said that the only thing left is the navy. What did he mean by that?
Well, he was first on the munitions. He was just marking, as we've seen some of the equipment that's being used just so old. I was asking his staff how NLAW, the Anglo-Swedish anti-tank missile, was faring against ERA, the explosive reactive armour on the tanks. These blocks, these sort of large brick shapes, large brick size of explosive armour on top of tanks that, as a round comes in, they literally explode to try and push the round away. But we're seeing all these turrets. The T-72 turret throwing competition is continuing unabated, and we see all these turrets with ERA that hasn't gone off. And I wonder, because NLAW is a single blast, Javelin has a double warhead, tandem warhead, how it was getting on against ERA. And you say, well, the officials were saying, well, we don't really know, because they're just not functioning. This kit is so old that the ERA is just not functioning. And Ben Wallace made the point as well. He said this war is not doing any favours at all, regardless of the massive impact on the Russian economy that the war is having and the sanctions are having. He's saying that it's just not showcasing Russian kit very well. He was saying NLAW, a few thousand quid, against T-72, low millions. I mean, guess what other countries are going to be looking to buy? It's not that hard to see which way they're going to vote with their cash. So he was just saying that there's a huge separation in just the technical ability, and that's clearly playing out on the battlefield.
And just one more question from me before Theo. I'm sure you've got lots of questions as well. But just one more from me. Towards the end of your notes, you say that he talks about how Ukraine is going to define success. I just thought that was very interesting, because as the attacker, you'd almost expect the Russians to be able to define what success is, but clearly that's not the case, according to Ben Wallace. And what does that have to do with the information war?
Well, so to define success. So this is the idea of where are we going. so I asked him, as you'll hear, we're going to put together for the podcast later, the interview I did with him later on in the day. I mean, quite at the end of the day, the sound quality isn't brilliant because he was eating a Twix at the time and drinking a cup of tea and blowing his nose. He'd had a long day. But I was asking him, how does a nuclear power safely lose a conventional war in the 21st century? So how can Russia lose this war without... We've seen these doomsday scenarios of Putin with his back against the wall using chemical, biological, nuclear weapons. And he was saying, well, I mean, that is one possible outcome of this war, but equally it's probably, and we will debate this in weeks to come, it will probably grind down to some awful stalemate. And at that point, Ukraine has some decisions to take, and it will be up to them to define what is victory and at what point do they sue for peace. But Wallace said that, and this is a quote, "There is not much appetite at the moment for a flawed peace deal. Like all deals, the question is not the deal, it's the implementation." And he was talking about Minsk and the Minsk II agreement, which happened after the 2014 invasion. And it's always the implementation. And he made the point that since the 2014 invasion, Ukraine have lost 11,000 soldiers and civilians. 11,000 Ukrainians have been killed since 2014 as a direct result of the action Russia took and the separatist areas. I mean, it's staggering, absolutely staggering statistic. But unless there's an outright victory from one side or the other, how much of this stalemate will be acceptable to Ukraine? And so he says it's not for anyone outside to impose their will. It's for Ukraine to define what is satisfactory to them. It's for them to define success. This will be really difficult. You may remember a few weeks ago when we spoke to Lulia Osmolovska, who is advising President Zelensky's negotiating team, and she made exactly the same point. She said it's one thing to have the country behind you when you have an existential threat, and the unity is not in question. But once you start having the conversation about what is acceptable in terms of peace, that's when healthy disagreement, healthy differences of opinion will be played by the other side and could turn into fissures and fractures and cracks if you're not careful. So this idea of what is peace and what is success is a wide open debate, and we will continue to have a look at this in great detail. Ben Wallace was just making that point and underlining that it's not for anybody but Ukraine to decide what is success for them.
Well, I've certainly monopolised the questions for a bit. Theo, do you want to come in at all?
Yeah, it's a question about Finland rather than Ben Wallace, really. We and you have written about Finland getting closer to joining NATO, and we had a feature in the Telegraph earlier this week about the underground bunkers that already that are sort of ready to be used there if there is an attack. I know you're on a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but from being there and seeing their ministers and perhaps speaking with some Finnish people, did you get the impression that they are really concerned about an invasion? They're really worried about the military threat from Russia?
No, I mean, we did ask Mr. Kaikkonen that exact question. I went with colleagues from the Times and the Mail, so that the three of us were huddled together with Mr. Kaikkonen, and no, I mean, they've had a couple of incursions this year. In fact, one yesterday, incursions into their airspace. Mi-17, Russian Mi-17 helicopters strayed about 5 miles or 5 k's over the border yesterday. There was another incident in January. But Mr. Kaikkonen said that the border area has been calm and stable. That's quote, calm and stable border area, but they have adjusted their force posture, adjusted their readiness levels. And we said adjusted up or adjusted down. He didn't say, but I don't think you adjust them down in the face of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. So they are wary, but I don't think there's any great imminence or concern of a Russian threat. Russia has made all sorts of noises that if Finland and Sweden apply for membership to NATO, then watch out, because we might come knocking. And Ben Wallace made the point, with what? Putin's put 65% of his entire army into Ukraine. A lot of it is not in good shape. I mean, what's going to go into Finland? Mr. Kaikkonen said that they've been subject to cyber attacks, but then, so everyone has. So not a huge increase in threat. It'd be interesting. I mean, Finland has a 1,300 kilometer border with Russia, which is about what the border is at the moment, if you take into account the other NATO members, and don't forget, of course, the Kaliningrad exclave, which borders Lithuania and Poland. So all told, at the moment, there's about 1,300 kilometers. That's going to double if Finland join. Not only, I mean, that's still only going to be sort of 9 or 10% of Russia's land border will border a NATO member. So hardly surrounded. But Murmansk is up at the north of that. So there might be Russia might feel as if NATO is better able to put assets in the area to have a look at the naval yards up in Murmansk. But I mean, this is just what happens if you go around bullying other countries. Don't be surprised if people want to join a defensive alliance to seek their own security. But no, Mr. Kaikkonen was clear that no decision has been taken at the moment. The mood music was that he was very, very warm to the idea of applying for membership. The question of what happens between applying for and getting membership, are you then vulnerable to the increased wrath of Putin in that time? And that was largely downplayed. I mean, Ben Wallace, he said there's no way that. There's no way that today, if Finland or Sweden was subject to external attack today, there's no way that there's no way that Britain and NATO would not go and help. And certainly, if they'd applied for membership between then and being accepted, if an attack happened, they would be defended. He didn't go as far as to say they'd be covered by Article 5, but we're largely dealing in semantics here, and I can't. It's so unlikely to happen that it's not worth expending a huge amount of intellectual energy on. But no, I think Finland will be a great addition to NATO if they choose to join, if they're accepted. Sweden as well, they have some very good capabilities. Sweden's ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, airborne capabilities are very good and very, very much sought after. They're doing dozens of sorties around the edge of Ukraine. I think there's some very good coordination, if not cooperation, between them and NATO in that regard. It will firm up. It will firm up the alliance. There'd be the 31st and 32nd members of NATO if they apply to join and are accepted.
And one final thing I thought that was interesting that Mr. Wallace, the British Defence Secretary, for those of you who are just joining us, said was how he could envisage Ukrainian troops training British troops. What did he? In what sense? And does this show the incredibly high regard that he has for the Ukrainian armed forces at the moment?
Well, yeah, he does. He holds them in very high regard. We were talking about the training, not only the training on all the kit that's being supplied out there at the moment, but also the British Army has been running Operation Orbital since 2014 or 2015, actually. So in response to the 2014 invasion, this is low-level infantry training, and it's trained about 22,000 Ukrainian soldiers. And I just asked him. I said, well, they've got some amazing experience, and it's not a new form of warfare, but the equipment is new and using loitering drones and what have you. So maybe a new way of doing anti-tank ambushes and amphibia, fighting in built-up areas, or fish, as we used to call it in the army, fighting in someone's house. And so I said, is there a mechanism for getting that experience back into the British Army and other NATO armies? So could we envisage Ukrainian troops coming to Brecon in Wales, the infantry training centre, and training us, teaching us? There's no need to be precious about this. You are on a hiding to nothing if you think, Mr. Putin, if you think your army cannot learn anything else, and you refuse to take knowledge and guidance and direction from those who are in a better place to give it than you are. And he was absolutely for it. He said, yeah, why not? What's not to like if they can come and train after the war, if they can come and train British forces in how better to do anti-tank ambushes using some of these new equipments, why not? So, yeah, watch out, Brecon.
Yes, thank you very much, Dom. That was fascinating, and hopefully for all of our listeners, especially our listeners abroad, gives you a good sense of the internal thinking of the British government and also our Nordic allies in Finland and Sweden. Well, in that case, can I ask you both for your final thoughts? What should we be looking for in the days ahead?
I saw just before we came in to speak that Zelensky has launched a global crowdfunder to fund the Ukrainian army and the counterattack on Russia and then the rebuilding of Ukraine, which I thought was really interesting. And we will try to find out, well, we will find out more about that. Because as we know, plenty of people and plenty of governments have been giving indirectly or directly to Ukraine through charities. But this is a new initiative in which individuals can donate to I think it's the Ukrainian Central Bank, and then it gets divided between various ministries and the army, which is, I think, an amazing initiative, and it'll be very interesting to see how that one plays out. So I'll be looking at that in at least this afternoon.
I'm going to be keeping an eye on the academics. Always wise to keep an eye on the academics. So Ben Wallace said that he'd posed this question to the think tanks, principally RUSI and IISS here in London, International Institute for Strategic Studies, and the Royal United Services Institute. Other think tanks are available, but he said to them, what is this going to look like at the end? Is it a Vietnam where a much more technically capable military is defeated because they didn't have home advantage, loss of public support, etc., etc., or is it going to look like the frozen conflict on the Korean Peninsula? And specifically, why are we left with North and South Korea? So, is Ukraine going to break the Russian army? And if it collapses, as it did north of Kyiv, he's saying it could very quickly turn from the quagmire it's in at the moment to a rout and could just collapse back into Russia, and there could be all sorts of upheaval then. Or does it just freeze? Does it bake in there on the line we've got at the moment down to sort of not the entirety of the Donbass, but a bit further forward from the February 24th line of control and the areas to the south? Does it just freeze there? What happens to these conflicts? Why does that endure? So he's put that question out to think tanks here in London and elsewhere, undoubtedly. I'd be really interested to hear listeners' ideas on that. You know, what is the difference between a Vietnam and a Korean Peninsula? Why do some conflicts go one way and some the other? So, yeah, I'll be keeping an eye on and chatting to the think tanks myself, and then obviously passing off their ideas as my own. And I'll be really keen to hear any thoughts anyone else has. Hi, I'm Dom Nicholls, Defence and Security Editor at The Telegraph. I was with Ben Wallace, the British Defence Secretary, yesterday in Finland. He was visiting the Ninsalo training area and his opposite number, Antti Kaikkonen, visiting British troops. We also had a chance to chat about the war in Ukraine and a few other bits and pieces. He was a bit tired, had a long day, long dusty training day, and so he was munching a Twix, drinking a cup of tea and repeatedly blowing his nose throughout this interview, so I can only apologise for the occasional loss of sound quality. How do you account for China's muted response to this war?
I would say that's a rebuff to Russia. So you're Russia, you're hoping your friends are coming to the rescue. China abstains, and Belarus just has lots of excuses not to really send any of its troops. I would say that I think it's hardly been full-throated support. I think China thinks instability is bad for business, and I think it is watching Russia.
Because early on we were worried that there were concerns that they might lean in with economic and military support. It doesn't seem to have been the case. Why do you think that is?
Because I think China are probably embarrassed by Russia's conduct, by its road to effectively international isolationism, and I think China probably doesn't see it in its interest to join the gangster next door.
How does a nuclear power safely lose a conventional war in the 21st century?
Safely?
Yeah.
we're worried that his back's against the wall and he's going to do something as crazy as invade another country.
Soviet Union lost the war in Afghanistan.
But that was the system. This is now invested in one man.
Well,
he's made it so, but that seems to be where we are. So how can Russia lose this war safely without these fears we have of chemical, biological or nuclear weapons being used?
I don't know. I mean, you're right. There is no check and balance. There's no Politburo to say, thank you very much, this way, sir. There's no checks and balance. But there are people in the system who will eventually realise that how can it safely... I mean, remember, he controls his media, so he can tell everyone tomorrow morning he's won a stupendous victory and get away with it. So I think, and they don't know what by the word safely. I mean, I think...
Well, without him using a nuclear weapon.
President Putin is a clever man, and he knows so far that escalation leads to escalation, and he knows that in Ukraine. At the moment, it's getting to the point no matter what he tries, it doesn't work. The Russian doctrine has the use of nuclear weapons in its normal warfighting plan. I don't think I really want to add to that by having a view of it. We've seen him evoke them, but I am, NATO is a nuclear alliance. Britain has a nuclear independent deterrent. That matters.
From the West, there have been differences of opinion which occasionally are dressed up as cracks in the Western alliance. I wouldn't suggest to go that far, but do you think we've seen as far as these differences of opinion will go, or the longer this carries on, do you think that there will be sufficient differences of opinion that Russia can push the alliance apart?
No, I think you're right to say not cracks. Let's look at it the other way around. The strength of an alliance is you can play to your strengths, right? So even Germany, I take the view that there are different times to play in Germany, right? Germany has always done a lot of support around healthcare, medic, ISR, transportation, foreign aid and development. Someone's got to be part of the pack to help rebuild Ukraine. So I don't think there are going to be... look at Bulgaria. Bulgaria is a really good example of a coalition government where you had some that were... I think one of them was a former communist, sort of more Putin-leaning, I wouldn't say pro-Putin, and others more Western-leaning. A bit like the Hungary, you've got a bit of a, yes, maybe, but we're not going to release the weapons. Well, that's been fixed, just when it gets a bit tough, Putin rides to the rescue. And suddenly, look at Lavrov's comments about Adolf Hitler being partly Jewish and the response that's got in Israel. So I think actually NATO has worked and is working. If you think NATO's main obligation is its borders, it is more unified, it is more determined, it is committing spending elsewhere and increased spending, it is helped deploy and facilitate a plan, but deployments at EFPs, Romania, Bulgaria. So that's more united. The EU's been pretty united on its sanctions and everything else, despite all this. It's going to be vetoed by this country. Turns out not to be. It's taken tough. Okay, it's taken tough sanctions. I actually think this has been a success of an international community working together.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Alice Hearing.